Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Climate change is so much worse than most people realize. The blistering summer and unseasonably warm fall of 2016 in Ontario and around the world add another pebble to the mountain of evidence about this urgent crisis. The world's climate is approaching multiple tipping points. There are likely only a few years left to avert long-lasting devastation. Soon there could be no turning back. Ontario is already warming faster than the world average, and our weather is getting wilder. Ontarians create more than our fair share of greenhouse gas pollution. I am proud that Ontario is, at last, joining the worldwide movement to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions. Ontario was Canada's climate leader when it closed the coal-fired electric generating stations. This is Ontario's and Canada's biggest contribution to date to reducing our carbon footprint. The last of these plants closed in 2014. 2015 was our first year ever with no smog days. Closing the coal plants is the main reason that Ontario reached its 2014 greenhouse gas reduction target. This deserves congratulations. The government also deserves kudos for its active role in national and international cooperation on greenhouse gas reductions. Action on greenhouse gases around the world is key to a survivable future. But Ontario still has a lot of work to do. Even without the coal plants, Ontarians have a carbon footprint that is dangerously large and twice that of northern jurisdictions, such as Sweden. I therefore congratulate the government for adopting Ontario's first climate change law, the Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act 2016. The emission reduction targets in the new Climate Act are ambitious, but they are amply justified by climate science and by Canada's international commitments. The Climate Act creates two main tools for reducing Ontario emissions: a cap-and-trade program that starts in 2017 and will slowly decrease the number of permits that Ontario issues for greenhouse gas pollution, and a climate change action plan to be funded from the monies raised from auctioning emission permits. The cap-and-trade program is reasonable and well-designed. It balances the urgent need for greenhouse gas reductions with the cost to Ontarians. Cap-and-trade has great potential to reduce Ontario's emissions and fossil fuel dependence over time at a lower cost to our economy than a carbon tax. The action plan contains some great ideas, including energy efficiency initiatives to help people reduce their energy costs. I do know how important that is. If done well, the action plan could also drive innovation and help transform our economy into a sustainable low-carbon economy with good local jobs. These opportunities are key to a better future. Together, these programs should also help keep more money in Ontario's economy by reducing our dependence on imported fossil fuels. Without the Climate Act, by 2020, Ontario would likely spend an extra $300 million every year to import petroleum products and natural gas, on top of the $11 billion a year that we already pay. So, it's a good new law, but there are pitfalls ahead. It's challenging to design and implement a complex solution to an extremely complicated problem like climate change. Our recommendations would help keep investment and greenhouse gas emission reductions in Ontario through appropriate use of auction proceeds and high-quality Ontario offset credits. In particular, our recommendations can help the government avoid three major risks: excessive dependence on California allowances, undermining their own program, and misuse of the auction proceeds. First, the government proposes to link our cap-and-trade program with California and Quebec starting in 2018. There are many good reasons for such a link, including reducing costs for Ontario emitters and preserving jobs here. But in the first few years of a linked program, it could be cheaper very often for Ontario emitters to purchase California allowances, permits to pollute, rather than to reduce emissions in Ontario. Well, does this matter? On the one hand, greenhouse gas reductions help preserve our climate no matter where they occur. Just keeping our imports of petroleum products and natural gas flat would more than offset the financial cost of importing California allowances. But too much reliance on California allowances would slow Ontario's transition to the low-carbon economy that's essential for our future prosperity, and could make it harder for Ontario to meet future greenhouse gas targets. There are also legal uncertainties that could undermine the California program or prevent international transfers of emission reductions. So Ontario needs a contingency plan if the link with California doesn't go as planned. Part of the answer could be a robust set of Ontario offsets. And increasing the organic matter in Ontario soils can also help, as shown by the Soil Health Technical Report that I issued last week. Number 2, undermining their own program. Unsubstantiated claims about emission reductions undermine the government's credibility and that of the entire cap-and-trade program. Our recommendations would help establish clear, transparent, and verifiable rules for cap-and-trade accountability. Our earlier reports have called on the government to stop programs that actively conflict with Ontario's climate objectives, such as subsidizing fossil fuel consumption and subsidizing the destruction of wetlands that are necessary for climate resilience. This work is still to be done. And third, misuse of the auction proceeds. The full cap-and-trade proceeds are urgently needed for the hard work of transforming Ontario's economy away from our current 80% dependence on imported fossil fuels. It would be a tragedy to fritter this money away. But the government could be powerfully tempted to siphon off the proceeds for purposes other than new greenhouse gas reductions. And the proposed billion-dollar subsidy of electricity rates is just such an example. I found no evidence that this subsidy will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Changing the funding source for existing conservation programs won't increase conservation. And in any event, most of the time, conserving clean electricity doesn't reduce emissions. 91% of Ontario's electricity in 2014 had no greenhouse gas emissions. Our recommendations would help to ensure that Ontario's auction proceeds are spent on the real greenhouse gas reductions that we need. So where do we go from here? Ontario has done so much right to face climate change. We met the 2014 target. Our emissions were 6% below 1990 despite substantial population and economic growth. Now Ontario has a much-needed Climate Act to help us meet the even more challenging targets ahead. Our recommendations, if accepted, can help the government avoid some obvious pitfalls. It must stay the course, meet the Climate Act targets, and get on with building a thriving low-carbon economy. We owe it to each other, and especially to our young people, to make this work. I don't want to have to look my children in the eye and explain why we threw their future away. Merci, thank you. I'll be glad to take questions.
Sorry.
Can you talk a little bit about the unsubstantiated claims about emission reductions? Can you give some specific examples?
Yes. In the action plan, there are many good suggestions and many initiatives that will have long-term benefits. But the government makes 3 major claims for emission reductions that they say the action plan will produce by 2020. And we didn't find any evidence to support 2 of them. For example, the government says that there will be 2.5 megatons of reductions in 2020 by industry adopting low-carbon technology. But they didn't provide any mechanism, any methodology, any analysis, anything to give this any kind of weight. And we're also concerned that they may be double counting, because they've already claimed 2.8 megatons just from the fact that we will have a price on carbon. And the third factor is that industry needs time to make adjustments, and they need permits. And the Ministry of the Environment has a very hard time getting permits out in a reasonable schedule.
So in your view, you're talking about the possible misuse of cap and trade proceeds. Should there be some sort of, how do you deal with that? Does there have to be some sort of rule that says, for every amount of money that we take out of this and spend on something, the government has to be able to tell us exactly how much they're reducing in emissions or that sort of thing, so they're not doing like you're talking about the $1 billion electricity subsidy?
Well, we made extensive recommendations in Chapter 5 about avoiding misuse of the greenhouse gas reduction account proceeds, and one of the things we've recommended is that the government should have a detailed justification for every expenditure out of that fund, and that the critical elements of that should be severable from the confidential cabinet documents so that the legislative officers can review it. We've also suggested that the minister's annual report on the use of the fund should be much more detailed than the Act suggests, so that the government can document that they are using the money properly. It's very important that they do so, and we're hoping that transparency and the interests of folks like you will help.
So at the moment they don't have anything in place that really ensures that, that you can verify that you can say, okay, well, they're spending $1 billion from this fund, and it actually is achieving greenhouse gas reductions. There's nothing that's...
Not that we've seen yet.
Madame Sachs, vous dites que ça va être difficile pour l'Ontario d'atteindre ses cibles au cours des prochaines années. On a atteint celle de 2014, mais pourquoi les prochaines vont être difficiles à atteindre?
Oui, je pense qu'ils seront beaucoup plus difficiles à atteindre. Fermer les centrales de charbon, c'était pas facile, mais c'était quelque chose que le gouvernement contrôlait eux-mêmes. Pour le futur, c'est plus difficile de voir ce qu'on va faire. On peut trouver d'espoir, par exemple, dans l'économie de la Californie, qui a trouvé possible de réduire les émissions à un pas assez élevé, une fois qu'ils ont adopté un système de plafonnement d'échange. Mais exactement comment, c'est pas du tout clair.
Vous dites que le gouvernement a mis en place assez de mesures pour des indicateurs pour vérifier que c'est bien atteint, là.
Ils sont déjà, encore sur les premiers pas. On a ce qu'on appelle le Action Plan, mais ça ne contient pas beaucoup de détails. Il nous faut les tels détails. Je sais que les gens dans le ministère de l'Environnement et les changements climatiques sont les très bons gens. Ils font de leur mieux, mais ça va prendre du temps pour voir qu'ils puissent livrer tout ce qu'il nous faut.
What kind of contingency plan should Ontario have, like you said, if the link with California doesn't work out the way that it's intended to?
Well, there are at least two kinds of options that could be. One is to find another trading partner. So, and I know that Ontario is already exploring additional trading partners, both with Mexico and with Manitoba. The RGGI, the Northeastern American states, are also an obvious possibility for trading partners. The second thing is to think about changing some of the rules. The Western Climate Initiative, which Ontario is a partner in with Quebec and California, for example, has an 8% limit on offsets for compliance purposes. If the California link doesn't work, a larger use of offsets might be appropriate.
What do you like? Where do you place the odds of it not working out with California, given that there is a lawsuit ongoing, that there is a bit of an opposition in the legislature, and given that the U.S. has just elected a new president who by no means is any sort of climate change warrior? Is there a good shot then that that the link won't pan out as it is intended?
I keep looking for a crystal ball in my desk drawer, and I haven't found one yet. I can tell you that I am seriously concerned about the California system, which is why I raised it in my report. I am more concerned about the prospects for reauthorization in 2020 than I am about the lawsuit because of the legal change in California that affects the reauthorization. It will take time for us all to know what happens. So, for example, if Governor Brown does go ahead with his ballot initiative, it'll be in the November of 2018. And we won't know until then whether it passes. And in the meantime, Ontario needs to go ahead with its program in some way. So this is why I didn't tell the government exactly what to do, but I wanted to draw to their attention that they can't simply blindly count on this working. It may not.
You say here also that that putting a price on carbon by itself would not be enough to get the reduction targets that they want for emissions. So,
Not unless the price were quite a bit higher than the government is currently proposing.
which leads me to my question two. Seeing that the federal government is offering provinces an opportunity to either pick a cap and trade system or a carbon tax, on the whole, did Ontario make the right call by going with cap and trade as opposed to a higher priced carbon tax?
Both a carbon tax and cap and trade can work. For an economy like Ontario, a cap and trade system is much more complicated, but it has the potential for having a lower economic cost. If the costs of compliance are generally similar across an economy, there's no particular advantage to cap and trade. But where you have large differences in cost for a greenhouse gas reduction, cap and trade can allow more of the reductions to be done in the lower cost parts of the economy. And Ontario, based on the work we did in our energy report, has a big range in compliance costs. So in principle, it could end up being cheaper, but it sure is a lot more complicated.
Do you have any concern about the choice to potentially add Mexico to the program? Do we know that their regulatory climate and compliance codes and stuff are going to be kind of up to snuff with places like Ontario and Quebec?
I have not yet studied the current status in Mexico. I am aware from my work in practice that there was a significant improvement in compliance in Mexico. I did some teaching in Mexico on environmental law to, among others, the senior judges. And they were moving from a pretty low level of enforcement and compliance to a better level of enforcement and compliance. That would obviously be a concern. As you may or may not be aware, in the Western Climate Initiative process, one of the steps is for each partner to be satisfied that the other partners have a stringent enough system. So California has to evaluate Ontario. Ontario has to evaluate California. It would be the same thing with Mexico. We would have to be satisfied that the system was real.
You said that you think that cap and trade would be better for Ontario's economy than a carbon price, or could be better than a carbon. All right. I guess everybody has to hedge a bit. Did you sort of evaluate that compared to that under the cap and trade system? It seems as currently contemplated that we're going to spend the first few years buying a lot of emissions credits from California, or that our companies will probably be doing that. I mean, is that even when you factor that in, the fact that a lot of Ontario companies will probably be sending money out of the province to California? Do you still was that part of your calculation in saying that the cap and trade could be better for the economy?
I didn't do a quantitative analysis, and I'm thinking about a fairly long term. But just for the next 4 years, what struck me the most is that we are so dependent on imports of fossil fuel. Again, compared to 1990, which is a baseline, we spend this enormous amount of money, $11 billion a year we're spending right now on importing natural gas and petroleum products. 2/3 of that for petroleum products, 1/3 for natural gas. And without the Climate Act, based on the best evidence I've seen, we would be increasing that by another $300 million a year by 2020. Well, from the data I've seen, that's likely to be more than buying from California. So the net benefit to me, there isn't going to be that much difference. It makes sense to me that we should be reducing our imports of fossil fuels, and we need to do that in a durable way because we have to continue to reduce them in order to reach our future targets. So, but the short answer is we didn't do a quantitative economic analysis, but just looking in principle at the economy as a whole. It makes sense to me that you want the most emissions done in the cheapest way. And cap and trade, in principle, should help do that over time, not quickly.
Is it the right sort of spirit though that that we're trying to reduce emissions, but really what we're doing for the first compliance period anyways will be buying a lot of those emission reductions in California as opposed to actually reducing the province's own emissions?
Well, it is likely that in the first compliance period, Ontario will be a net buyer of allowances. That is very likely based on the cheapness of allowances in California, the large number of allowances they've produced, and the fact that it will take time for reductions to be made here. But how much of the reductions we made here depends on a lot of factors, and I already mentioned I didn't have that crystal ball. But offsets can keep a lot of that money and a lot of those reductions here. We know we have tremendous opportunities here. Again, going back to my energy report, what we showed is there's a huge range of efficiency in, for example, public buildings. And that suggests there's an awful lot of room to reduce the amount of energy that we waste. And if we waste less energy, then we have less money going out of the province to buy imported energy. We have better air quality. We have lower energy bills. And we can do more with what we have. And that, I think, is the real key to moving forward. The International Energy Agency has estimated that between 30 and 40% of the emission reductions that the world needs by 2050 can come from improved efficiency. We know that Sweden, for example, reduced the energy consumption of its buildings by 80% over a generation by systematically paying attention. We're just starting that. So we have a lot of room to improve, and that can go a long way economically, environmentally, and from a climate point of view.
Does the government need to hurry up and kind of get some of the details of these different plans out there? Because, as you talk about buildings, for instance, I mean, they've talked about notionally, doing, I think 3 or 4 different programs for different types of buildings for, energy efficiency and solar panels on roofs and geothermal in the basement and all this kind of stuff. But we really haven't seen, any detail at this point in terms of how that will work, or a lot of their other, the other kind of programs that they're doing, besides the pure price signals. I mean, do they really just kind of need to, I guess, get the let out and kind of get those programs rolled out so that we can start, seeing those emissions reductions?
I would love to have all the rules out and the regulations and the plans and the policies and the programs. I absolutely would. I agree with you. And I wish we'd had them 5 and 10 years ago. But I do know that the folks in the Ministry of Environment are working as hard as they can. They all have bags under their eyes. I don't think they can work any harder. I think they're doing their best.
Does Ontario need to consistently sell out all of its emission allowances? I know in the States right now and in Quebec, the last few auctions, they've not had very good results. And that might, in the future, jeopardize some of the GHG reducing programs that they're trying to. So do your assumptions and the government's assumptions rely on every single emission allowance that they're putting up for sale being sold? And if that doesn't happen, can the province still hit all of its reduction targets?
Well, no market system is dependent on everything selling every time. From my analysis, the major reason that the allowances didn't sell in California, the California-Quebec auction in May and August, was because of the legal uncertainty. The first auction in May that happened, where they only sold 11% of the allowances, that happened just a couple of weeks after the California Court of Appeal issued this totally extraordinary letter. So definitely there are some legal doubts there. But I guess I have a couple of responses. The first is that in 2017, of course, Ontario is not linked anywhere. So nothing that happens outside Ontario affects those auctions. But whether or not all the allowances are sold doesn't affect the effect of the price on private behavior. It does affect how much the government would receive, or could affect how much the government receives through its greenhouse gas reduction account. And so you'll see one of the things that I've pointed out is they need to have an explicit set of priorities. If there isn't as much money as they're counting on, how are they going to spend it, and in what order? So I think that's important.
A bit of meandering question I asked there. So I guess what I'm really trying to ask is, given that you already said that there are some questions about the emission reductions that are being touted in the Climate Change Action Plan, and given that price is not the only thing that's going to reduce emissions,
Yes.
does everything in that action plan need to be funded and come to pass for Ontario to hit all of its GHG reduction targets?
Well, there are a lot of different ways for the Act to be complied with, and I do expect that we will see compliance by Ontario emitters in 2020. Some of that will be through offset credit. Some of that will be likely through purchase of allowances, possibly from outside the province. Some of that will be through actual reductions. Some of it will probably be through early reduction credits. So We will see, I imagine, that the private sector responds in some of the ways we expect, in some other ways, and it's not going to be exactly as envisaged in the action plan. But what we've seen in other cap and trade systems is that once pollution goes from being free to having a price on it, and smart people have to start thinking about what to do about it, they come up with things. So you remember with sulfur dioxide, both in the US and in Canada, originally industry said, no, the sky is falling, this will cost a fortune, we can't possibly afford to reduce our sulfur dioxide emissions. And once there was a price on it, it didn't turn out to be that hard. So I think we'll see lots of smart people coming up with good ideas, and I don't know what they're going to be.
So that, the industry that sometimes, they've all been pretty careful, at least on the record, to pretend they support, carbon pricing. But the industries that do, in some capacity kind of complain, do you think they're just sort of, this is all just a lot of, complaining and whining for nothing from them?
Well, so I did want to point out, you will see over here, can you still hear me if I walk over here? Yeah? Yes, no? You can, they can't?
They can. And that's what.
Okay, is this better? All right, so you can see here, for those of you who can still see this, this is the chart of the difference between Ontario emissions in 1990 and in 2014. So you see from electricity, that's where the largest reductions came from. That's all from closing the coal plants. And again, in 2014, we still had one coal plant running, so there's still a little bit of coal emissions in that. But basically, you had more than 19.5 megatons of reductions in Ontario just by choosing the coal plants. But if you look across this chart, you'll see there's only one other sector that reduced, and that's industry. Everybody else went up. Freight emissions more than doubled between 1990 and 2014. So there's certainly more room for industry to reduce, absolutely. But they have already started reducing. It's everybody else that's going up.
Did industry reduce, or did Ontario's industry kind of die off a bit after the recession in 2008?
Some of each. There is one big reduction here, which is the closure of a chemical plant in Maitland, Ontario. But there's also, for example, the steel mills becoming more efficient and using more recycled steel, doing less blast furnacing. There is a page with a lot of details on it, on page 45 of the report, where you'll see the detailed numbers for each sector, what reduced and what didn't. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if you look across the economy, natural gas use in buildings is way up. Transportation use is enormously up. Industry did go down, and they have been working hard on efficiency, not necessarily to save the climate, but to save money. But there's room for everybody else to do a lot more. And, if we hadn't had the reductions both in electricity and from industry, we would have had a huge increase in emissions by now. Dealing with climate change is a economy-wide challenge. Ontario's economy is 80% fossil fuel dependent right now. And to get from that to an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050, everybody is going to have to get in the act. Everyone's going to have to come up with ways to be more efficient. Did I answer your question? Okay. All right, anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much.